The soft glow of chandeliers bathed the elegant restaurant in golden light, casting shimmering reflections against the polished marble floors. The rhythmic clinking of silverware hushed conversations, and the gentle hum of classical music created an atmosphere of refined luxury. The patrons, dressed in designer suits and evening gowns, savored their exquisite meals, completely detached from the world beyond the glass. Amidst the perfectly arranged tables, Emily, a waitress with a kind heart and a weary but determined spirit, moved gracefully between guests, ensuring each one was satisfied. She had worked here for years, balancing trays with effortless precision, offering smiles to customers who barely acknowledged her presence. To them, she was invisible. As she made her way toward the kitchen, something outside caught her eye. Through the large, frosted glass window, a frail, homeless man sat on the cold pavement, his body hunched against the biting winter air. His tattered coat barely shielded him from the wind, his fingers trembling as he cupped his hands together for warmth. But it wasn't the cold that made Emily's heart ache. It was the way he stared longingly at the plates of food being served inside, as if trying to taste them through sheer will. Customers walked past him without a second glance. Some quickened their steps, others turned their heads, pretending he didn't exist. He wasn't part of their world, just another shadow on the street, someone to be ignored. Emily hesitated for only a moment before making her decision. She turned toward the kitchen, her eyes landing on a still warm plate of untouched food, a meal a diner had ordered but barely touched. Without a second thought, she wrapped it up, grabbed a steaming cup of coffee, and pushed through the heavy restaurant doors into the frigid night. The sudden rush of cold air made her shiver, but she barely noticed. The homeless man's eyes widened in disbelief as Emily knelt before him, placing the food into his hands. He looked up at her, his lips parted in shock, as if he had forgotten what kindness felt like. "You shouldn't be hungry tonight," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth the winter air had stolen. For a moment, the man said nothing. Then, his eyes welled up with emotion. His fingers clutched the food as if afraid it might disappear. "You have no idea how much this means to me," he whispered. Emily simply smiled, her heart lighter than it had been all evening. Everyone deserves kindness. Just as Emily turned to head back inside, a furious voice shattered the moment like glass breaking against stone. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She spun around to see Mr. Carter, the restaurant's strict, profit-obsessed manager, storming through the doorway. His face was flushed red, his sharp suit wrinkled from rage, and his fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The chatter inside the restaurant faded as heads turned toward the commotion. Wealthy diners, accustomed to an evening of quiet luxury, now found themselves entertained by a different kind of spectacle. Waiters paused mid-step, their trays hovering in the air. The entire restaurant fell into an eerie silence. Without a second's hesitation, Mr. Carter snatched the plate from the homeless man's hands. The man barely had time to react before Carter turned and, in one swift motion, hurled the food straight into the trash. The homeless man flinched, his shoulders curling inward as if he had just been slapped in the face. The warmth that had filled his chest moments ago, the brief flicker of dignity Emily had given him, was crushed beneath the weight of Carter's cruelty. Emily stared in shock, her breath caught in her throat. Did that really just happen? "That was unnecessary," she finally burst out, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. Mr. Carter's glare burned into her like a brand. "We are not a charity, Emily. Feeding beggars makes us look cheap." Emily's hands curled into fists. "It was going to be thrown away," she said through clenched teeth. "He wasn't hurting anyone." Mr. Carter stepped closer, towering over her, his breath heavy with arrogance. "This is an upscale establishment. The people who eat here don't want to look at trash while they enjoy their meal." His words dripped with venom. Emily's stomach twisted in disgust. "This man is not trash," she spat back, her voice shaking with rage. Mr. Carter laughed coldly, shaking his head. Then his smirk twisted into something even uglier. "If you care so much about feeding the homeless," he sneered, "then why don't you join them? You're fired." A stunned silence settled over the restaurant. Customers exchanged shocked glances. A few waiters gasped, hands covering their mouths. Even the chefs, peeking from behind the kitchen doors, stood frozen. Emily's chest tightened, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. With trembling hands, she ripped off her apron and threw it onto the floor. "You're a cruel man," she said, her voice steady yet filled with contempt. Then she turned back to the homeless man, kneeling beside him. Her eyes shone with regret as she whispered, "I'm so sorry." The man's weathered hands trembled as he placed one gently over hers. His gaze, though tired, held wisdom. "Some people don't see the value in others," he murmured, "until it's too late." Emily took a deep breath and stood tall. Without looking back, she walked out of the restaurant, her heart pounding. She was jobless, humiliated, but unbroken. Emily sat on a weathered bench near the restaurant, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she stared at the cold pavement beneath her feet. The evening air was crisp, biting at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy weight of uncertainty settling in her chest. She had worked at that restaurant for years, late nights, long shifts, smiling through exhaustion, and now, all gone in an instant. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. How would she pay rent? Who would hire her now? The thought of job hunting, again, made her stomach twist. She glanced back toward the restaurant. Through the large glass windows, she could still see Mr. Carter, standing with his arms crossed, boasting to a table of wealthy patrons, probably laughing about how he taught a lesson to an employee who had stepped out of line. Her blood boiled. Just as despair started creeping in, a deep, powerful roar filled the air, a sound that didn't belong in this quiet part of town. Emily lifted her head, eyes widening as a sleek black luxury car glided to a stop in front of the restaurant. The polished exterior gleamed under the city lights, the engine's purr smooth and controlled, oozing wealth and power. The restaurant's valet rushed forward, straightening his jacket as he reached for the door handle. The door swung open, and a sharply dressed man stepped out. His tailored suit fit him like it had been stitched by hand, exuding refinement. A gold watch peeked from under his cuff, catching the glow of the streetlights. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he straightened, adjusting the lapels of his jacket with practiced ease. But it wasn't just his appearance that commanded attention, it was his presence. There was an air of quiet authority about him, the kind that made people pause, take notice, and instinctively step aside. Emily watched as the valet lowered his head respectfully, but the man barely acknowledged him. His focus was locked onto the restaurant. Then, something strange happened. From across the glass, Mr. Carter's face drained of color. His confident smirk faltered, his body tensed, and for the first time that evening, he looked genuinely nervous. Emily's brows furrowed. Who was this man? And why did Mr. Carter look like he had just seen a ghost? Inside the restaurant, whispers spread like wildfire. Every waiter, chef, and guest felt the shift in the air, as though something monumental was about to unfold. The sharply dressed man strode in, his presence demanding instant attention. Every eye turned toward him, his elegant yet powerful aura impossible to ignore. Mr. Carter, clueless to the storm about to hit him, quickly plastered on his most polished smile. Years of managing high-end clientele had taught him how to butter up the wealthy, and this man, he reeked of power and money. "Welcome, sir," Carter said, his voice a little too eager, a little too forced. "How can we assist you today?" The man's piercing gaze swept the room, but it was clear he was here for one thing. His eyes locked onto Mr. Carter with a look so sharp it could cut glass. "I heard you just fired someone," the man said smoothly, his tone like steely velvet. "Over a plate of food." Mr. Carter's smug grin flickered, his composure wobbling slightly. He swallowed hard, sensing danger. Well, sir," he stammered, grasping for control. "She broke company policy." The man raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. The sheer authority in the gesture shut Carter up instantly. And what exactly was her crime? The man's voice remained calm, yet the weight of it pressed down like a storm cloud. Showing kindness? A few gasps rippled through the restaurant. Waiters exchanged looks. Customers leaned in. The tension in the air was thick enough to slice. Before Mr. Carter could fumble for another excuse, the restaurant doors swung open again. All heads turned. The homeless man from earlier stepped inside. But something was different. His back was straighter, his eyes sharper, his posture no longer hunched in defeat. He wasn't the shivering, pitiful figure from outside. Mr. Carter's face drained of color. His breath hitched as realization clawed at his throat. "You," he croaked, barely above a whisper. The well-dressed man beside him placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of respect, not pity. "You don't recognize him, do you?" Mr. Carter's eyes darted back and forth, trying to piece together a reality he couldn't comprehend. Then, the homeless man removed his ragged coat and revealed a perfectly tailored suit underneath. The restaurant fell silent. He straightened up, his stance radiating authority, and looked Mr. Carter dead in the eye. "Jonathan Reed," he announced, his voice no longer frail but commanding. A stunned gasp rippled through the restaurant. "Co-owner and investor of this restaurant chain." Mr. Carter nearly collapsed. The weight of the moment slammed into him like a freight train, his entire body locked up, his jaw hanging slightly open. This couldn't be happening. Jonathan turned to the staff, then the guests, his voice booming across the space. "I was testing the restaurant today, and I've never been more disgusted in my life." The whispers grew louder. Some customers covered their mouths in shock. The waiters stood frozen, their expressions swinging between horror and awe. Jonathan's gaze snapped back to Mr. Carter, his eyes filled with cold disappointment. "You fire employees for being kind? You humiliate those in need? Not in my business?" Carter's knees nearly buckled. His mouth flapped uselessly, but no words came out. Jonathan didn't wait for an excuse. He turned to the assistant manager and delivered the final blow. "Fire him! Immediately!" Mr. Carter stumbled backward, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for someone, anyone, who could save him. "Please, sir, I didn't mean—" Jonathan's expression hardened like stone. "Security!" His voice was like ice. "Show him out!" Two security guards stepped forward instantly, their grips firm as they seized Mr. Carter's trembling arms. He thrashed weakly, his face burning with humiliation. "Wait! This is a mistake! You don't understand!" The guards dragged him toward the door. The moment his feet crossed the threshold, applause erupted. The entire restaurant, staff, guests, and even some of Carter's former employees, cheered. Kindness had won. Jonathan stepped outside into the cool night air, his breath steady as he took in the sight of Emily sitting on the same bench where he had once felt invisible. Her shoulders were slumped, her gaze fixed on the pavement, lost in thought. She had given so much without expecting anything in return, yet here she was, alone, jobless, uncertain about her future. She didn't hear him approach. When she finally looked up, her brows furrowed in confusion. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. Jonathan smiled, a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Because you didn't just save a homeless man today?" He paused, his gaze steady. "You saved my faith in humanity." Emily blinked, clearly unsure how to process his words. Before she could respond, Jonathan reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a sealed envelope. He held it out to her. "Take it," he said simply. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope, the weight of it unexpectedly heavy. She tore it open carefully, her eyes scanning the contents inside. Then she froze. A job contract. But not just any job, a managerial position at one of Jonathan's high-end restaurants. Salary, benefits, a future. Emily's breath hitched. She looked up at him, completely stunned. "Why would you do this for me?" Jonathan's smile never wavered. "Because people like you deserve to lead." Her eyes filled with tears, the weight of everything hitting her all at once. Just hours ago, she had lost everything, and now she was being handed an opportunity she never even dared to dream of. She tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. Jonathan chuckled, patting her back gently. "You believed in me when no one else did," he murmured. "It's only fair I return the favor." Inside the restaurant, whispers had turned into excited conversations. Staff exchanged glances, still reeling from the chaos that had unfolded. Then, the doors swung open. Emily stepped inside, but this time, she wasn't just an employee. She was the new boss. Every waiter, every chef, stood straighter, waiting for her words. She had once been one of them, but now, she led them. Mr. Carter stood outside, watching through the glass window. His face was pale, his posture stiff. The same place where he had once exercised his power and cruelty now belonged to the very person he had fired without a second thought. Jonathan, standing beside him, watched with a proud smile. His disguise was no longer needed. He had proven his point. Kindness had finally come full circle, because sometimes the smallest acts of compassion spark the biggest changes.